For whatever reason, anticipation is one of the more misunderstood concepts of what we do.
Anticipation?
Huge, man. It's everything. It's everywhere. It's little tiny infinitesimal, and sometimes it's gigantic, and you see it coming a mile away.
Without it, your movement is going to be unnatural. It's going to be poppy. It's going to be jerky.
Anticipation is like something that you could forever keep learning about, I think.
Without anticipation, it doesn't look right.
Anticipation is a lot of different things.
Anticipation is setting up an action.
It's sort of like the storing and releasing of energy, the squashing and the stretching.
Anticipation is giving weight and a feeling of momentum or inertia to your character.
Probably one of the best ways to start examining the idea of anticipation is to start with the basic principle of squash and stretch. Squash and stretch is easily one of the most important principles because it is so fundamental to everything that we animate. It's fundamental to the way that we walk and the way that we move. It's fundamental to the way that you animate inanimate objects. Just one of the most basic ways you can give life to a character is through squash and stretch. Squash and stretch really truly does become a big part of the foundation that you will build your acting performances on and that you'll build your scenes on. I use it in probably every scene. Probably the clearest way to examine squash and stretch is with the bouncing ball. A bouncing ball assignment has been the foundation of animation schools for the last century practically, and it's that way for a reason. You can learn so much from animating a bouncing ball or animating different bouncing balls with different weights and made of different materials. And that will teach you so much that you will always be applying to walk cycles, you'll be applying it to an acting performance, to anything. And the basic idea is if you've got a ball, a rubber ball, let's say, and I throw that ball up into the air, on the way up, if I've thrown it with enough velocity, it's going to maybe start to stretch a little bit because it's going so fast. And then once it reaches the apex, the very top of that arc, it's going to kind of squash up because the top part of that ball is going to start to slow down a little bit before the bottom part of that ball. And so as the top part starts to slow down, the bottom part is still going up, and that creates a squash, like that. And then on the way back down, the bottom part of the ball, since it's lower or heavier, or I don't know, we can think about it in these terms anyway, the bottom part is going to start to fall before the top part. And slowly over time, that's going to lead into more of a stretched shape, right? And as it's coming down, its most stretched moment will be the frame just as it's touching the ground, just as it barely touches. And as soon as it hits, bam! It's going to squash, right? And the reason it's squashing is because the bottom part of that ball has hit the ground, but the top part of that ball is still rocketing downward, right? It's still falling. It hasn't hit anything yet. So it's going to want to compress down, and then if it's going to bounce back up, the bottom part's got nowhere to go. It can't move because it's stuck on the ground because the top part is squishing down on it. So the top part is going to bounce back up before the bottom part, creating another stretch. And as it goes up, it's going to squash at the apex, stretch on the way down, hit the ground, squash, stretch, lift up, and that's the basic idea of squash and stretch in a bouncing ball. Now, are there times when you wouldn't want to use squash and stretch? Sure. It depends completely on the material and the weight and what you're going for. If you're going to be dropping a bowling ball onto the ground, for example, in a scene, you probably wouldn't want it to squash and stretch at all because you want that bowling ball to look very solid and very heavy. If you're doing, let's say the opposite of that is a ping pong ball, where it's very light, you're still probably not going to squash and stretch a ping pong ball too much. If you do, it would be very slight. But you probably, if you want it to look like a ping pong ball, you're going to probably not have it be very squishy. Conversely, if you throw a water balloon and you want a water balloon kind of bouncing and sloshing around, you're going to be using squash and stretch like nobody's business. The material really can decide how much squash and stretch you're going to use.
I mean, you have to know a rule before you can break it intentionally. Otherwise, it's like with like squash and stretch and things like that. You see people like you get a demo reel and people put squash and stretch on a bowling ball, which is perfectly fine if that's an aesthetic choice. But if you're just going like, oh well, squash and stretch is one of the 12 fundamental principles of character animation, so I need to apply it to every single thing, and then you got to sometimes it's not appropriate, sometimes you got to bend it, sometimes you got to break it, sometimes you got to ignore it. But you don't, unless you know the rules first, you can't do it creatively or appealingly.
Okay, so I know. You're sitting there, you're thinking, okay, that's really basic, I get it. You squash and stretch with bouncing balls, but how does that apply to a human movement? How does that apply to a physical performance? If I'm doing some kind of big action scene, how can I use that? The body isn't all rubbery and squishy, right? Actually, you can use that a lot, and you'll find as you progress through your kind of journey of becoming an animator that you're going to be using it all the time. One place where it's very easy to see the correlation between squash and stretch on a bouncing ball and how to apply that to a human physical performance could be in a jump. If you overlay the idea of a ball kind of bouncing along the ground, overlay that with somebody jumping, you'll see a lot of very obvious correlations. The body, for example, works just like, the overall body works just like the ball does. So let's say the ball is going to come in. Let's say it's coming in at an angle. It's going to be all stretched out just as it's about to hit the ground. It hits the ground and squashes, and then it stretches out, launches back up into the air, squashes again at the top of the arc, stretches back on the way down, hits the ground and squashes, and continues on. A person jumping works just the same way. If they're going to jump, they're standing there all normal. They squish up, which is going to be them balling up, which is going to be the anticipation to the jump, which we're going to get to next. But they ball up, and then they stretch out as they go into their jump. And that last frame before a person leaves the ground, his legs are going to be like as stretched and straight as they can be, because he's launching himself up with as much force as he can muster, probably. Once he goes up in the air, he's stretching up into the air, and then as he reaches the top of that jump, the apex of that arc, he's going to squash back up, and his knees are going to come up. And the reason is because the top half of his body has stopped going up, but his feet are still going up, and that's going to cause that squash in the air. And then on the way back down, he's going to stretch back out, and the reason for that mostly is because he wants to get his feet